Welcome to the Parenting Then and Now podcast, the show that remembers the good and sometimes the not so good old days of parenting past. I'm your host, Samantha Kemp-Jackson from the Multiple Mayhem Mama blog, and every week we'll be talking about how things were then and how they are now, parenting through the lens of the ages, if you will. Now, whether you're a parent, a kid, or someone who used to be a kid, you'll want to stay tuned as we reminisce about the past, embrace the future, and marvel in the present how things have changed. If you're ready to glance back in time at kids, parenting, and the good old days, you're in the right place. So sit back, relax, and let's take a trip down parenting's memory lane. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Women's roles in both the home and the workplace have drastically changed in the last century. The post-war 1950s ideal of the happy housewife, whose life's work included only having the cleanest floor and the most immaculately kept home, was only further promoted by such television staples of the time, Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy. In the former, June Cleaver, the mom in the show, wore a crinoline hoop skirt and a pearl necklace while vacuuming. Really. In the latter, Lucy Ricardo was a hapless housewife who couldn't help but get into trouble, as evidenced by her often angry husband, whom she had to defer to in every episode. In the following decade, the 1960s, there was a cultural shift, and many women were burning their bras in defiance of what they perceived to be oppressive and archaic gender roles. And while this may have been the case for a vast segment of the female population, just as many women were at home, keeping the family together and living the domestic life that they may or may not have wanted to live. This because change doesn't often move as quickly as we'd like it to move for everyone. This latter scenario was a familiar one for Vicky Sanderson, who grew up in a home where her mother kept things together domestically, but also taught her daughter the importance of having a voice, of pushing back against preconceived gender roles, and for being someone who questioned the established norms of the day. After all, asking questions is a good thing. Vicky, an expert in lifestyle, design, and the home, sat down with me to talk about her childhood, growing up in the 60s and 70s, feminism, and so much more. It was an interesting conversation, to say the least. Here's our interview. So welcome to the Parenting Then and Now podcast, Vicky. Thanks for being here.
It is absolutely my pleasure.
And I'm so excited to have you here because you are a home lifestyle expert, and you have been for many years. And I want to talk about the change and the shift in home life, family life from your perspective, because I think you have a very unique perspective just based on your work within the field, but also the fact that you're a mom and you have kids and you've seen shifts from the time that you were a child to now, probably in a lot of ways, inside the home and outside. So before we kind of go down that road, I'm going to ask you just a little bit about your background, where you grew up, how old your kids are, all that kind of stuff.
Great. Well, we can start with where I grew up, if you like, and that was in King City, which is about a 30-minute drive north of Toronto. When I moved there from Agincourt when I was 3, I think the population was 1,700 people. There was a grocery store, a general store, a bank, and a doctor's office. So it was really very typical small town Ontario life.
Wow. And when you say small town Ontario life, what was your typical weekend, for example? What did it look like? What would you do?
Well, it depended. I mean, for one thing, there was far less sort of structured time. So a typical weekend might not be anything consistent or extraordinary. Oftentimes it was just being outside. When the sun came up, you went out to play, and when you got hungry or the sun came down, it was time to come in. But, especially on the weekends, lots of hockey, although that would have always been my 2 brothers and not my sister and I, because in those days, girls didn't play hockey.
Oh.
We learned to figure skate or did ballet, but there was no notion of girls playing hockey back then.
That's really interesting. And would you mind if I ask what era you were a child? If you don't want to tell
I
me
was
that.
born in 1958, so I came of age during the 60s, and I was thinking about this this morning. I guess it would have been, 62 when Kennedy was shot. I do remember seeing that on the television. Trudeau was elected in 68. The Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup, I think, in 67. I may have some of those years wrong, but they're more or less correct. So that sort of time of a lot of change in Canadian life during that decade.
Very interesting. So in the 60s, so if you were born in 1958, you would have been obviously 10 in 1968. During that time, that was still in the realm of very specific gender roles, would you say? So was that when your brothers were playing hockey and you were doing figure skating and more quote-unquote girl type of activities? Or when did it start shifting?
Gender roles were very much defined back then. Like I say, the boys did hockey, the girls did ballet. The girls wore skirts, the boys wore pants. Much to my sort of social failure, the girls were supposed to be quiet and not bossy and, pliable. I was none of those things. I think I was asked a lot of questions and was a bit noisy and rambunctious and didn't like to comb my hair. So didn't sort of fit into that structure. But those structures were very much in place. Now, interestingly, one of the things I remember from that period is that a lot of my role models were women who were just coming out in broadcasting. My mom listened to CBC radio all the time. So I would hear Barbara Frum on CBC Radio. I would hear Betty Kennedy on CFRB. I would watch Adrienne Clarkson on an afternoon talk show called Take 30 because those were the people that my mother was listening to. So it occurred to me the other day that from a very early age, I had a notion that women did have a voice. Doris Anderson was the editor of Chatelaine at the time, again, a magazine that my mom got. So these very strong social cues about what a nice girl was supposed to be, but also these other women who were sort of subconsciously communicating the notion that you can ask questions, you can be strong, you can be intelligent, and all those things are perfectly compatible with being a woman.
Now, that's really interesting. So on one hand, your mother was obviously looking towards women who were kind of shattering the status quo in terms of what women and men were supposed to be doing inside the home and outside the home. Yet she was probably still pressured by external society to make sure that her girls did this and her girl did this and her boys did this, hockey or whatever.
She was absolutely sort of, playing into those roles and probably to a large extent constrained by them. So, yeah, she was very much living the life of a suburban housewife and doing all the things that entailed. Now, she did have a bit of a rebel past. She was born in 1922 in Manchester, and she was the one who, at the age of 12, I think, got into deep trouble at school because she tried to start a Down with Mussolini club.
Oh.
And she made little pins that said, Mussolini must get out of Ethiopia. And she got into trouble with the headmistress because, again, girls do not make those kinds of notions known.
That's actually fascinating that she was against fascism.
When she was 12.
When she was 12,
Yeah.
which most of us, if my 12-year-old came to me and said, I want to fight fascism, I'd say, right on, sister. And yet it was more important that she adhere to the gender roles of the day to be a quote-unquote quiet, timid woman or young girl who didn't kind of speak out.
Yes. Well, not to get into that too deeply, I think that a lot of women at that time had the same sort of notions that my mom did, but realized that it was easier, more, life was going to be smoother if they just, stuck to these rules. And there was, I think, enormous pressure still on them to be the, great suburban mom who had high heels and makeup on when the husband came home. Yeah. I think those were still powerful messages, but I'm really grateful that my mom was exposing me to those other messages as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were growing up, did she work outside the home when you were a small child or a teenager, or was she working inside?
She never worked outside the home. That would have been sort of antithetical to to my dad's kind of modus operandi too. She did volunteer, especially in small town Ontario. The thing then was that moms volunteered either through a local church, or my mother used to organize rides for people who had cancer and were going downtown to Princess Margaret Hospital. And in those days, like, getting downtown from King City, that was a big deal. Lots of people didn't have cars, so she organized that. Later on, when everybody was in high school, she got a job working in a travel agency part-time. And that was, sort of probably a bit of a joke to my dad, but she has talked then about how important it was that she have a little bit of money of her own. But she was still, playing that role of the housewife. Dinner was on the table at a certain time, and all that jazz was still in place.
And isn't it interesting? And we see this all the time, even today, that it doesn't matter if both males and females are working outside the home, women still take on the lion's share of housework or house-related work, whether it's cleaning, cooking, organizing, emotional energy towards planning kids' doctor's appointments and shuttling them back and forth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even though back in the day in the 70s, remember that commercial, "We've come a long way, baby"? I don't know that we've come that far, because I think it's still happening.
Well, it's interesting. I too, every once in a while, look at those StatsCan figures that talk about how much work inside the home is done by women, and the gap is narrowing. But we still do the majority of that, and I think that is going to. I think that is going to change, and it certainly has changed a lot since we've come a long way, baby. Interesting to think that was about smoking.
Yeah.
But that would have been, interestingly enough too, that would have been around the same time. I think I would have been in grade 6 or something. We had a public speaking contest school-wide, and my topic was women's lib. As a matter of fact, the title was "Women's Lib Were Not Just Kittens Anymore."
So you were an agitator from way back.
I've always been a bit of a,
subversive.
Disturber. But again, I think it just points to around that time how many different influences and social mores and images were being sort of thrown at me. So I think I am an interesting mix of a lot of those different messages, and I think even the way I live my life in my home today is reflected in some of that.
How so? How would you say that?
Well, some of those things, I got my mother was a fantastic cook, and had to be, because, if dinner was not up to par, she would, she would hear about it. So I have a lifelong love of cooking, of preparing food. I love nothing more than to make a great big old meal for a great big old bunch of people. I'm still interested and think in sort of, for want of a better term, housework or home maintenance. In the sense that I think if you treat your bed linen properly, it'll last longer and be nicer to sleep in. Those things are sort of ingrained in me as a female, but I think a lot of the lessons that I learned at my mom's feet are still the ones that make life more beautiful and healthier and happier today.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really interesting. So you're also a mom. You have kids.
I do.
And your kids are older now.
Whose idea was that?
I don't know. Was
mine.
it yours?
Yeah.
So how old are your kids, Vicky? And I'm curious to find out from you how your youth growing up translated to how you became a mother and how you conveyed your values to your children.
Well, I do have, we have a blended family. So our kids range from Vanessa, who's 37, Elise is 30, I have Emma, who's 25, and James is 22.
Okay, so you've got a big range of kids.
Yeah.
So your younger two would have been growing up, I guess, in the 90s,
yeah.
right?
When I met my eldest stepdaughter, Vanessa, she would have been 10, and that would have been 1990. And Elise, I guess, around then would have been 4. So I've had exposure to a fairly wide age range of kids.
Right. And now in the 90s, what were the messages you were getting as a mom, as a step parent, and as a biological parent? And how were they in sync with what your values were at the time and also how you grew up? Was there any conflict there? Did you feel that you were kind of breaking the mold in terms of how you had been raised? Were you going to make a statement in terms of how you were raising your son and daughter and your older daughters?
Interesting. Those are really interesting questions. First of all, in some ways, I would have absolutely made a conscious effort to do things differently than my parents did. Of course, in retrospect, and I'm sure you've had this feeling too, you look back on your parenting and think, why didn't I do that? Why didn't I do this? And for me, most of that is sort of a slight regret that I wasn't just more relaxed. And I think that is a message that should be communicated to parents of every generation. You know
How
what?
So?
Well,
what do you mean?
I think that in the 90s, okay, there was a lot of pressure to, were your kids getting the right after-school programs? Were the birthday parties the right kind of parties? Or did you have the right kind of loot bags? Were you participating sufficiently in the extracurricular life at your kid's school? And looking back, I think that for many different, what kind of foods were you feeding your kids? God forbid that any of that should be, junk food or fast food. And I think that for many different types of parents and different types of families, many of those things would have, been made life easier, simpler, happier. But I think there's always so much pressure on parents to do it right, to do it properly. I think, you know what? If you truly love your kids, if you love them enough to discipline them when necessary and back off and let them make their own mistakes when necessary, if you feed them reasonably good food and make sure, they get enough rest, a lot of the other stuff, I think we could just kind of take a Valium about.
I think you're absolutely right. And on that note, we're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsor, and we will come back with Vicky Sanderson. Okay, so we're back and we're talking with Vicky Sanderson. So Vicky, as a person whose expertise is in design and the home, what trends have you seen occur in relation to the shifting family dynamics today, and where do you see things going?
Oh, there's so many sort of points of reference you can use for that one. One of the ones I was thinking about on the way down here was our changing relationship to synthetic and chemical materials.
Oh.
When I was growing up, it was all about, better living through electricity, chemistry, what have you. If we had, say, ants in the house, you got out the can of Raid and just sprayed it all the way through. If there was a stain on your shirt, Mom got out the carbon tetrachloride and, dabbed a little bit.
What is that?
It is some whaling chemical that is a known carcinogen that nobody, goes near anymore. I think it's actually dry cleaning fluid.
Oh my
Very,
goodness.
very volatile. But back in the day, hey, took those stains out. So, and it was readily available. So a lot of that has changed. Much more sort of conscious about what I expose my kids to. But some of those other things like, a family meal. We had a family meal with everybody around the table pretty much every night when my kids were growing up. Now, that was partly because I had the luxury and the privilege of working from home. So in that sense, too, I may have been raising my kids in a much different way, but I was also fulfilling some of what I remember that was best about my childhood, which was when I got home from school, my mom was there to make me a cup of hot chocolate or help me with homework, and I was able to do that. So that was a constant in my experience.
Do you think that that's something that's lacking today, that parents are often not home after school? I mean, not through any fault of their own. You know, we all have to work to make a living. But do you think that that's one of the things from the past, perhaps from your childhood, that you think is something positive that we might be able to bring back, or we should look at bringing back as a society?
Well, if we were going to bring it back, we would have to look at a massive social and political change. And hey, up the sisterhood, I'm all for that. I think that it's very, very difficult for a lot of families, especially young families, to make that happen. But in my experience, it was a wonderful, wonderful thing. I didn't make the kind of big bucks that I might have made if I'd been out, conquering the corporate world. But I felt better. I felt good about playing that role. One of the big things that's changed even since my kids have grown up now, though, is that I don't think 20 years ago, that question would have been posed to me as a woman, but almost never to a man. And I think now it's much more sort of acceptable and normalized to think that that a male parent could play that role as well.
That's true. And even here in Canada, we're talking now about changes to our paternity leave and maternity leave, and having more time given to men than to men just as much as women, or at least to a certain degree.
Right on, dude. I mean, when Emma was born, my husband had just finished teacher's college and was looking for a job, and I had a good secure job to go back to. So he spent the first 6 months with Emma, and I think I can see that in their relationship today. So I think the more sort of support,
just from that 6 months, what do you think? What do you think occurred?
I don't know what occurs. I think it's maybe occurring on a subcellular level or something.
That bonding.
It's just being around people connects you to them. So I think whatever we can do to advance that as a society, I think it's going to pay off. But hey, I'm a champagne socialist, so.
Many of us are here. One thing I want to just kind of go back to, you had alluded to the chemicals that were being used in the home previously when you were younger, and probably when I was younger as well. And there's more of a change, I guess, now, and more of a consciousness in terms of our environment and in terms of our health. How is that manifesting itself in day-to-day life with kids and parenting now? And what do you think is going to be the next iteration of this in terms of home life and family life and home decor, if you will?
Well, I think that
no more plastic furniture cover. I know that.
Yeah. I think that there's just going to be much more consciousness of not only what we're putting in our bodies, but what is in the surfaces that we live with. I think there's a lot of research coming up about, synthetic textiles, for example, are great, and they last longer than, a lot of the previous incarnations do. But I think there is really going to be a focus on people being or wanting to be educated about what's in the materials that they live with, the products that they clean with, and the food that they put into their bodies. I think it's enormously complex now, and I think there's a lot of different layers. But I think that people are going to continue to ask questions about that, and I think increasingly, I hope that they're going to turn back to simple solutions. Like in my home, you want to know what I do most of my cleaning with? I have a spray bottle that's full of hydrogen peroxide. I have another spray bottle that's full of vinegar. I spray some of the vinegar on a surface, and then I spray some of the hydrogen peroxide on the surface. I clean it, and I have the germ killing ability that I've created there is roughly akin to bleach, but I haven't made any sort of environmental footprint. So, I hate to sound like, one of those oldsters, but a lot of those old, simple cleaning solutions are really effective, really eco-friendly, and super simple to do.
So, Vicky, do you think that we should be teaching this type of, or not this type of, but should we be teaching our kids some of these, as you call them, kind of old skills or, general skills that we used to teach our kids back in the day in home ec class and shop class? Because we don't teach it anymore in a lot of places. And I feel like a lot of kids don't know these things like the vinegar and the...
I'm hesitant to say we should, because I'm conscious of how, I look around at the young parents that I see today, and they seem so busy and so pressured. And for example, in some jurisdictions like Toronto, they're working so hard to say, buy a house. But I do think that a lot of those basic skills, cooking, cleaning, are things that you are going to keep throughout your life. They're going to make life healthier, happier, and more economical. Again, though, I think that there's been a real shift in the sort of gender expectations around those jobs. For example, of the two kids that I still have at home, Emma and James, James is the one who cooks. He's the one with whom I talk about recipes and how we're going to prepare the this or the that. Emma lives off Cliff Bars and yogurt, and every once in a while moans about how, she really should learn how to cook. On the other hand, I say, Emma, you don't really like to cook, do you? And she said, no, and I basically have no interest in it.
And isn't that interesting that somewhere in her psyche, she has taken on that feeling that, I guess I should cook, right? Where is she getting that from? That must be a societal thing.
I don't know, because I don't think she's getting it. I don't think she's getting it from me. I've tried really hard not to say you should do this as a girl and that as a boy. And to all my kids, I've said you should find the things that you really love to do and do them. And Emma, if you really don't love to cook, there's lots of prepared options. There's lots of ways, you can just stay healthy by making sure you get lots of fruit and, fresh vegetables. But hey, you don't like to cook, do something else. There's no sense for me that, what? You're a failure as a woman.
Do you feel that your parenting style in your peer group and in your kids' peer group, being in their early 20s, is it atypical, do you think, Vicky? Or do you think that more people are kind of coming along the lines to realizing that gender does not automatically mean that there are certain things that you should or shouldn't be doing in the house and beyond?
I would like to say yes, but a couple things I've noticed recently. One is the rise of the gender reveal party. Couples who are expecting babies are having these very elaborate parties, the end climax of which is that we find out whether the baby is a girl or a boy. And hey, it's good, clean fun. I'm not trying to rain on anybody's parade, but I do find it extraordinarily interesting. Like, okay, so now it's a boy or a girl. What does that mean? And I asked a couple of young women, and I was so surprised and almost shocked to hear a 27-year-old say, well, that way I'm going to know what color to paint the nursery. And my jaw sort of dropped. I thought, wow, it's like 2017 and we're still blue and pink. Mm-hmm. I've noticed several of the young people that I know, and don't get me wrong, I'm not a millennial basher. I love that the future lies in youth, and I think many of them got so much more going on than I ever did at that age. But I noticed too, there's this other thing where if somebody's getting engaged, the young man goes to the young woman's father and sort of announces his intention, and the phrase I've heard is kind of asks his permission. And as, the author of the prize-winning speech, Women's Lib, we're not just kittens anymore, I am wondering, what? Permission for... So I think that there's... but I think part of that has to do with we're the world is moving so quickly and there's so much going on that we're yearning for tradition. So we're sort of pulling back to some of those. But some of them I look at and I go, what the actual heck?
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So there's a throwback now to that asking permission. I hadn't heard that. So this is happening now again.
People I've heard talk about that.
And millennials.
I love millennials.
I love millennials too, but I this is actually surprising me. That's why I'm a bit tongue-tied, because I didn't know that this was happening. I'll have to look into that. But why do you think this is happening now? Is it because do we want to harken back to a time where, quote unquote, people knew their place and women knew their place and men knew their place? I'm saying that facetiously, but you know what I mean? Is that what you think is happening? I don't know,
because when you think about it, that generation wouldn't have really been raised with that. But I think I think that it speaks more to a desire for social ritual that we've had since, we first got together around a fire and made a group. I think that social ritual gives meaning to people's lives and makes them feel like they're part of a community. And I think that life has gotten faster and more fractured and more sort of... we're getting more and more into sort of hyper camps where we don't connect or communicate. So I think there's maybe a yearning for some of those markers of society when it was more just simpler.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually a good segue into what you do in your daily life in terms of your home, lifestyle, decor, business, and writing and discussion, your expertise. Are you finding that people are asking for more simple environments around them in terms of their home life, the decor that they choose for themselves, the way that they choose to live their lives, which is usually reflected in the home?
I absolutely do think that, and simplicity is a key word. I think that people want life at home to be simple, to some degree sustainable. I think increasingly the energy efficiency and eco-friendliness of the home is important, but they want it has to be really functional. And I think one of the biggest effects that has had is that when I was growing up, you mentioned plastic covers on the furniture. There were rooms that were don't touch, and that was the dining room or the living room. Maybe it was a sitting room, but nobody sat there. It was just to be looked at. Right? Yes, you didn't live there, and it was how well it was appointed was an indicator of your social status. I don't think there are many houses, with the possible exception of Buckingham Palace, to have rooms like that people just don't use. For one thing, the notion of heating them and cooling them is silly. So I think every room has its purpose. The most illustrative of this, of course, is the kitchen, which has gone in my lifetime from a room that was closed off from the rest of the house, probably had a door in it, and would have been very separate from the rest of the house. Now it is open concept. The function of the room is very different. You use it for homework, for entertaining. It's really sort of morphed into a multifunctional room. So there's that. And then there's also the fact that so many more people now work from home. So the home has to, in many cases, fulfill the function of an office space as well. So the home office, or the rise of the home office, has really influenced the way the home is laid out, who uses it, how it has to transition from one part of the day to another. And that's especially true in condos and apartments where people work from home. Yeah. So that has given rise to all this fabulous transitional furniture. For example, you can get a coffee table that now morphs into a desk or a credenza. There's just really so many options, so many variables, so that you can configure a room in just about any way imaginable.
I think also that has to do with the fact that we're living in smaller spaces now, especially urban dwellers. I mean, as you said, there's a lot of condos, and oftentimes if they're in a downtown center and it's a large populace, it's not going to be very big because A, there's no room, and B, it's too expensive. So that probably would speak to why we're seeing different configurations in furniture and furnishings. But I also think that there's been this shift, like what you said about the kitchen being multifunctional, whereas it used to be kind of behind the scenes. And also I noticed, you've probably noticed this too, the whole idea of open concept, that wasn't a thing when I was a kid in the 70s. And now it seems that that's kind of more the norm, not the exception. How do you see that equating with shifts in family life and shifts in generally how we live our lives on a day-to-day basis?
Open concept has some really interesting roots in that it really came as part of the rise of mid-century modern design. And that included a lot of really neat things like bigger windows, more picture windows, so that you could see a bigger vista. You could connect the indoors with the outdoors better. And then I'm going to say starting like the 80s, when the first, in Toronto anyway, when the first big wave of renovation came, everybody thought that it was going to be just a great idea to knock down all the walls and make one floor of a old narrow Victorian into one big space. And in many cases and in many ways, it was a good idea, and it was a really efficient use of space. I think what people forget sometimes is that rooms were sometimes closed off as for a purpose. Like, it's great to have an open concept, but if you've just
and you can't stuff things under the bed or on the bed or whatever.
Oh, honey, you can always stuff things under the bed. But if it's the kitchen, for example, and you've got your living space just beyond that, and you've had sauerkraut for dinner, that's going to be right up in there. In your nose. So there's all different questions of, ventilation, lighting, what kind of flooring are you going to put down? So open concept has its pros and cons, but it all boils down, as it always does, to how well the space is designed. And that always starts with, how are you going to use it?
Right. So how does that all play into the whole trend of smart homes?
Oh, well, I have just started experimenting with smart home technology. So I've been talking to Alexa and Siri, and I figured out that I don't have to say thank you to them each time they do something for me. But I think that there is just going to be an explosion of smart home technology. And I think that one of the things that's most interesting to me right now is that I can see from the pitches I'm getting, from the brands that are talking to me, that the manufacturer of these devices and apps and what have you have really understood that there are markets across all demographics. So they can come to, a 60-year-old oldster like me and say, well, Vicky, I know you're a little afraid of installing that smart thermostat, but did you know that you could save 30% on your monthly energy bills with a smart thermostat? So I start to look at that and I think, well, yeah, I could automatically turn down my heat at night. It can sense when I'm leaving the house and turn the temperature down. If I have sensors in certain rooms, I can tell that I'm going into my office for the day, so that the rest of the house could be automated. There's all sorts of functionality with lighting. If one of the people in the household works late every night and comes home at 11, you don't want to leave the porch light on all night. You can set your devices to turn it on at 5 to 11 so that it's on for 5 minutes while Susie or Jimmy comes home. There's just so many features and options for what the smart home technology can do. I think that we're really going to see that explode. I think along the way we're going to see some really dumb stuff. Like, well, I won't mention any of the things I think are kind of dumb because I wouldn't want to irritate anybody. But I think that we're going to see some stuff, as we always do with any sort of generation of gadgets. We're going to see some stuff where initially it looks super cool, but we'll realize over time that it's not really worth the trouble. But again, I would go back to some of those energy efficient features and options that could really not only make life at home easier, more healthy, but be better for the planet.
This is really interesting that this is kind of near the end of our discussion, but I want to go back to one thing that you said in relation to the smart homes, because you said that you were just so thankful that you came home and your mom was there with a hot chocolate or to make you a snack after school. And now we're moving so much further away from that model, whereby these smart homes are going to get smarter and smarter and smarter. There's a lot of discussion in, the general world about AI and robots and, artificial intelligence and virtual reality. And so these things are creeping up and increasingly becoming more the norm than the exception. And I think that's going to be, the way that our kids or kids of the future are going to get used to, living their lives. So instead of coming home to a nice hot chocolate, maybe, your home will have it ready for you sitting there when the child comes home from school. But is that a good or a bad thing? Because it's so far away from the way you and I were when we grew up.
So many things, it's good and it's bad. And I try really hard these days to keep in mind that my perspective always has some sort of generational aspect. When you talk about smart home and kids, one of the benefits might be that, okay, your 11-year-old comes home from school. You're not quite home from your work yet, but you want them to have a healthy snack. If you have a smart oven, you could have a setting so that Joey or Jimmy could put in, a bowl of vegetable curry or a homemade pizza, and just press a certain setting, and it would know what to how to cook it. The kid could easily, quickly have a snack. There's all these other all this other technology that allows you to, talk to your kid and see what they're doing through in-home cameras and all that jazz. I have very kind of mixed feelings about that, because surveillance in general always makes me a little nervous. So I think that we have an enormous potential here to do incredible things with technology, but as Spider-Man, or Spider-Person, I guess we would say these days, says, with great power comes great responsibility. And I'm not sure whether, as a society, we have really understood how broad the implications of this technology are, and to what degree we have to sort of try and control it and legislate it, especially if we want it to enhance our kids' lives and not take it over.
That's quite ominous.
I have a lot of faith. I have optimism about the human race. I think, I have 4 kids. They are all magnificent human beings. I know tons of great young people. I believe they will prevail.
I think they will too. And, I have to say that the whole thing about surveillance that you alluded to, a lot of parents are now tracking their kids already, right? Because you can track your kid through their iPhone. You can just find my iPhone on your phone and you can just look and see where it is. Or, parents have GPS tracking on their kids and their kids. So it's happening already.
Yeah, but I'm kind of I know you've talked before about how it's important for kids to have some freedom and some room to maybe make some mistakes and some independence that's age
I strongly believe that. I don't
appropriate.
track my teenager. I don't track her.
Yeah.
I trust her to text me and tell me where she is.
Yeah.
And I have to believe that. I don't and I don't want to get to the point where I'm looking all the time at where she is. Just like the same reason that I wouldn't go through her stuff in her room. I'm just that's not my thing. I don't think that fosters trust. And I don't think that helps the child to become the person that they could be, with integrity, with, telling their parents the truth, with all kinds of things. And I know that's, in some circles, not very popular. I know a lot of parents think it's great to read their kids' diaries, or, well, they don't have diaries anymore. I'm aging myself, but read their stuff online, read all their stuff and go through all their stuff in their room and go through.
I don't know why that they think that is an acceptable. To me, that's an invasion of
it is, I think it's
privacy,
an invasion of privacy.
I'm not sure what I'd be teaching my kid by doing that. But again, lots of different styles of parenting and lots of different families. But I'm with you that they need space to learn and space to grow.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think that you have covered everything I wanted to cover today. So I want to thank you very much for coming to the Parenting Then and Now podcast and for giving me and all of the listeners all of your expertise related to home, family, growing up, changes, and all of that stuff. And where can everybody find you online, Vicky?
Well, they can go to my website, which is aroundthehouse.ca. I'm on Twitter, ATH with Vicky, that's with a Y, and that is also my Instagram handle. So they can find me.
Great, and I will put links on the PTAN podcast website and show notes, and we will share. So go and check out Vicky's various online personas. She's everywhere, and her stuff is great. So go find her, and thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, that was an interesting discussion. Who knew, with the trend towards open concept in home renovations and constructions, we would lose more functionality in our homes, considering the fact that now, more than ever, so many of us work from home and therefore require specific spaces to function as offices. I was heartened to hear about Vicky's mom, her taking on roles that helped others as well as herself, that also showed Vicky that it was important for a woman to have her own life, her own careers, and her own passions. I also took away from this conversation the very real fact that we've still got a long way to go, baby. That gender stereotypes still persist, as evidenced by the gender reveal parties that have become popular and the resulting societal dictates about pink and blue baby layettes that often occur following these revelations. Yes, we've certainly got a long way to go, but we are on the road to getting there, and that's a good thing. That's it for the PTAN podcast this week. If you like this show, please subscribe in your favorite podcast provider and leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps others to find the show as well. Thanks, and see you next time.